The message arrived at 0300 hours, ship time. A pulsing violet crystal delivered by a drone that dissolved into smoke the moment Ambassador Ethan Voss touched it. The holographic text it left behind was simple, cold, and absolute. You are summoned to the inner sanctum of her eternal radiance, Queen Seraphil of the Vorin Empire. Come alone. Come unarmed. Come before the twin moons align. Ethan stared at the message until it faded, then sat on the edge of his cot and pressed both palms against his face. 3 months. 3 months of careful diplomacy, rehearsed greetings in Vorin dialect, memorized protocol charts thicker than his arm. And somehow he'd done something right. Or something very, very wrong. The Vorin home world of Ethon 7 was nothing like Earth. It was a planet that seemed built from ambition and light. Crystal spires that absorbed starlight and redistributed it in shifting colors across the sky. Gravity platforms that floated entire districts above violet oceans, and a capital city, Velcara, whose palace alone was larger than most Earth nations. The air smelled faintly of ozone and something floral that had no human equivalent. Ethan had been stationed here as part of Earth's first official diplomatic corps, a gesture of goodwill following the Accord of Silence, where humanity agreed to stop broadcasting signals into deep space after the Vorin made it politely but firmly clear that they'd been listening for decades and were not impressed. He dressed carefully. Dark formal suit, the Vorin diplomatic sash across his chest, deep gold, signifying a welcome stranger. He slicked his dark hair back and studied himself in the reflective wall panel. 34 years old, broad-shouldered but lean, an academic's eyes in a soldier's frame. That's what his ex-wife Dana used to say, usually right before an argument. Dana. He pushed the thought down. Not tonight. The palace corridors were alive even at this hour. Alien advisors in layered robes moved in silent clusters. Guard creatures, tall insectoid with iridescent shells, stood at every archway, their compound eyes tracking Ethan without moving their heads. He'd learned not to make sustained eye contact. That, at least, was universal. The inner sanctum doors were obsidian black and 30 feet tall, carved with relief scenes depicting Vorin history in unsettling detail. Wars that looked more like weather events, celestial bodies being rearranged, and at the center, a single female figure standing above it all with her arms stretched outward as if claiming the sky itself. Queen Seraphil. He'd seen her twice. Both times from a distance. Both times the air in the room had shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the ventilation systems. The doors opened without a sound. Ethan straightened his sash, exhaled slowly, and stepped inside. The room beyond swallowed him whole. The inner sanctum was not what Ethan expected. He'd anticipated a throne room, grand, performative, built for intimidation. Instead, he entered something intimate. The chamber was circular, roughly 50 feet across, with a ceiling that had been made entirely transparent, opening to Ethon 7's night sky where 2 moons hung close enough to seem almost within reach. The floor beneath his feet was warm, a dark stone that pulsed faintly with bioluminescent veins, like a living thing breathing beneath him. There was no throne. There was a wide, low-resting platform near the center, layered with dark silks and what appeared to be woven starlight, actual threads of captured luminescence that shifted as the fabric moved. And on it, half reclined, was Queen Seraphil. She was not what diplomatic briefings could prepare a human being for. The Vorin were tall. She stood nearly 7 feet when upright, with elongated limbs built for a world where reaching mattered more than strength. Her skin was deep cobalt, shifting toward violet at her temples and the tips of her fingers, and faintly luminescent in a way that made her look lit from within. Her face was angular but not harsh, high-set cheekbones, large eyes the color of molten copper, and a brow ridge that gave her expressions a gravity that human faces simply didn't carry. Her hair, if it could be called that, was a cascade of dark filaments that moved with a slowness that suggested they responded to emotion rather than air. She wore less ceremony than he'd ever seen on her. A draped garment across her torso in deep burgundy, but her long legs, 4 of them, arranged in 2 pairs with the primary pair forward and longer, were uncovered. They were extended across the platform, and even from the doorway Ethan could see the tension in them, the subtle rigidity of something held too long in a position of performance. She didn't look up when he entered. "Ambassador Voss," she said. Her Voron-accented English had improved remarkably since their first meeting, each word placed with the deliberateness of someone who refused to stumble. "You came without guards. You asked me to. Others have been asked and brought guards anyway." She finally turned her copper eyes toward him. "Sit. Not there. Closer." He crossed the room and lowered himself onto a cushioned surface near the edge of her platform, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her. A Voron biological signature, he knew. They ran several degrees warmer than humans. Silence stretched between them. "You are wondering why you were summoned," she said. "I assumed you'd tell me when you were ready." Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. "The Voron High Council wishes to reject the trade framework your people proposed. I have been arguing against that decision for 11 days. Ethan kept his expression measured. And I am tired," she said, the words seeming to cost her something. "Tired in a way that your species understands better than mine is permitted to." He noticed it more clearly then. The subtle tremor in her lower limbs. The way her primary legs were locked at an angle that would be, for a human, the equivalent of clenching a fist for hours without release, without thinking, without the diplomatic calculus that should have governed his every move in this room. Ethan reached out and placed his hands carefully around her lower primary leg, just above the joint. He applied gentle pressure the way he'd once learned from a physical therapist after his own injury. Slow. No agenda. The Queen went absolutely, terrifyingly still. The bioluminescent veins in the floor pulsed once, bright, then dimmed. Her filament hair rose. Then slowly, the tension in her leg released beneath his hands like a cable finally given slack. And Queen Seraphiel made a sound, low, almost inaudible, that Ethan had never heard a Voron make. It sounded unmistakably like relief. The silence that followed was so complete that Ethan could hear his own heartbeat. He held his position, hands still gently braced against her leg, pressure light, waiting. Every diplomatic instinct told him to pull back, apologize, explain. Every human instinct told him to be still. The Queen moved first. She turned slowly, those copper eyes settling on him with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. Her filament hair had lowered, not fully, but enough. The luminescence beneath her skin had shifted warmer, toward amber. "You know what you have done," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I'm not sure I do," Ethan answered carefully. Seraphiel studied him for a long moment. "The Voron do not touch one another's legs. Not the lower limbs. Not without." She paused, searching for the word in English. "Covenant. An agreement of trust that must be earned across many years. Even my advisors, those who have served me for decades, do not touch me there. It is not permitted." Ethan felt cold move through him. "I didn't know. I believe you." Her voice was unhurried. "Which is why you are still in this room." He exhaled carefully. "How serious is this?" "In ancient tradition," the Queen said, shifting her body to face him more fully, "when a being outside one circle of covenant performs the vishal, the easing touch, without training but without malice, it invokes the right of the welcome stranger." She watched his face as she spoke. "Not as ceremony, as binding recognition. My body accepted the gesture, Ethan Voss. It recognized what your hands offered as genuine." "What does the right mean practically?" he asked. It means that I am now required, by laws older than this palace, to treat you as what the gesture declared you to be. Her copper eyes held his steadily. An intimate advisor. Someone who has access to my private counsel. Someone whose voice carries weight in chambers even my generals cannot enter. Ethan sat with that for a moment. The trade framework. The High Council's opposition. The 11 days she'd been fighting alone. And if I decline the role? You cannot, she said, without cruelty. Not without insulting the covenant your hands already made. The right does not ask permission after the fact. For the first time, something played at the edges of her expression that wasn't authority or calculation. I am aware of the position this places you in. I did not arrange for it. I believe you, he said, echoing her words back, watching her register it. Seraphiel leaned slightly closer. The warmth of her was more present now. Not aggressive, but no longer held at a distance either. You are not afraid, she observed. I'm very afraid, Ethan said. I'm just better at managing it than I look. The sound she made then was new. A low resonance that seemed to come from her chest rather than her throat. He realized with a jolt that it was the Vorin equivalent of a laugh. Your predecessor, she said, would have fainted. He did faint, Ethan said, at the welcome reception. Twice. This time the resonance was deeper. Her filament hair drifted with it, softly. And Ethan noticed, though he carefully kept his expression neutral, that the queen had not moved her leg away from his hands. The contact remained. Quiet. Whoa. Significant in a way that every language, human and Vorin, would recognize. The High Council meets at dawn, Seraphiel said after a while, her voice lower now, less performance, more person. You will attend beside me. Not behind me. Beside. What do I say? Nothing, at first. Your presence will say everything. She paused. But if the moment comes, and I will make a moment come, speak plainly. The Vorin have been spoken to in careful language by your people for months. Careful language is for those you don't trust. Ethan looked at her. Really looked. At the tension slowly releasing from her frame. At the loneliness that a queen keeps so well hidden that it becomes invisible to everyone except someone who hasn't learned yet to look past her. You've been carrying this alone, he said. Not a diplomatic observation. A human one. She didn't answer, but her amber luminescence deepened slightly. And outside, the twin moons of Ethon 7 had nearly aligned. Dawn on Ethon 7 arrived in waves. The primary sun cresting the Crystal Mountain range east of Velcara, its light fracturing through the spires into 1,000 moving colors that swept across the palace like a slow tide of fire and gold. Ethan hadn't slept. He and the queen had spoken through the remaining hours of the night. Not always about politics. She had asked him questions about Earth with a directness that cut past the diplomatic glossaries and cultural pamphlets his corps had prepared. She wanted to know what rain felt like, what grief looked like on a human face, whether the stories about human music affecting involuntary emotional responses were true. He'd found himself answering honestly, more honestly than he had in years. At some point she'd had food brought, Vorin dishes he couldn't entirely identify, but ate anyway because she was watching, and something in that watchfulness felt less like a test and more like curiosity. She ate little herself. Seraphiel, he was learning, consumed attention more readily than food. Now, walking beside her down the Hall of Seven Voices toward the High Council chamber, Ethan felt the shift in the palace immediately. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-syllable. The guard creatures at the archways oriented toward him with an attention they hadn't shown before. The Vorin advisors they passed, robed, dignified, ancient, stared with an openness that, in any other species, would have been considered rude. They know, he said quietly. Word of the Veishal travels fast in my court, Seraphiel confirmed, her voice pitched low for him alone. She walked in full ceremony now, her primary legs carrying a deliberate, unhurried cadence, her filament hair pinned upward in an elaborate arrangement that added to her already considerable height. She was magnificent in the way that thunderstorms are magnificent. Beautiful and not entirely safe. Are they angry? The older ones are disturbed. The younger ones are. She considered. Intrigued. The Veishal has not been invoked in 300 years. What happened 300 years ago? A Vorin queen made a decision that saved our species, she said, because she listened to someone her council told her not to trust. Ethan absorbed that as the great doors to the council chamber opened, the High Council of the Vorin was 7 beings. Ancient, imposing, draped in silver so dark it was nearly black. They sat in a curved formation around a raised central floor, and every one of them tracked Ethan's entrance with a particular stillness of those who are very unhappy and very controlled about it. Seraphiel took her position at the center. Ethan stood beside her. Not behind. Beside. Just as she'd said. The head counselor, Elder Veth, a Vorin so old his luminescence had faded to a barely their pearl, spoke first. In Vorin. Sharp, direct, disapproving. Seraphiel translated without looking at Ethan. He says your presence here is a disruption of sacred protocol, and requests that you be escorted to your quarters until the council concludes. What would you like me to do? Ethan asked, matching her quietness. Remain standing. He remained standing. Veth spoke again, longer this time, his tone taking on the specific edge of someone reciting law to make a point. Seraphiel answered him in Vorin, steady, unhurried, but with a weight that changed the temperature of the room. When she finished, 2 of the 7 council members shifted in their seats. One younger counselor's luminescence flickered in a way Ethan was beginning to read as discomfort. He cited the ancient text prohibiting outsider participation in covenant rites. Seraphiel told Ethan. I reminded him that the same ancient text he quoted contains chapter 12, which specifies that a Veishal performed by an outsider without guile supersedes council objection. He was hoping I hadn't memorized chapter 12. Had he forgotten you'd memorized it? He had forgotten I memorized everything. And then Seraphiel turned to Ethan, visibly, deliberately, so the entire council could see, and nodded. His signal. He spoke plainly. About Earth. About what the trade framework actually offered. Not in the diplomatic language of careful distance, but in the direct language of someone describing something real. He spoke about scarcity and abundance, and what human history had learned, painfully, about refusing to reach across difference. He made no grand appeals. He made no promises. He simply told the truth about what this partnership could build, and what both people stood to lose if pride won the morning. When he finished, the chamber was quiet. Then, slowly, the young counselor whose luminescence had flickered placed both palms flat against the table. A Vorin gesture Ethan's briefing materials had described as a sent under witness. 2 others followed. Elder Veth stared at Ethan for a long moment with ancient copper eyes. Then, with the visible reluctance of someone eating something sour, he placed his palms flat as well. The vote was 6-1. The trade framework would proceed. Seraphiel said nothing until they were back in the corridor. The great doors closed behind them. Then she turned to him, and her filament hair drifted freely, and her amber luminescence was the deepest he'd seen it. And she said, in a voice meant only for him, you spoke as though it mattered to you. Not as a mission, not as an assignment. It does matter to me, Ethan said. She looked at him in a way that no protocol chart had prepared him for. Then stay, she said. Not as an ambassador, as my Veishal advisor. There is a title for it. There are chambers set aside. There is a role that has been empty for 3 centuries. Ethan looked at her, at the queen who had shown him her tired legs and her honest face in the middle of the night, who had laughed for the first time in who knew how long, who had walked him into a room full of opponents and trusted him to speak. "I need to contact my government," he said. "Of course. They may say no. Then you will have to choose," she said simply, "between what you were sent here to do and what you may have actually come here for." She left him standing in a corridor full of shifting golden light. Ethan stood there for a very long time. 3 days passed. Earth's Diplomatic Oversight Committee met twice. They argued, deliberated, cited precedent that didn't quite fit, and ultimately did what bureaucracies do when faced with something genuinely unprecedented. They stalled. Ethan did not stall. He moved into the chambers set aside for the Veishal advisor, a suite of rooms that opened onto a private terrace overlooking the violet ocean, where the bioluminescent tide came in at dusk and turned the water to something that looked like liquid fire. He learned more Vorin in 3 days than he'd learned in 3 months of formal study, because Seraphil had taken to correcting him directly, with an impatience that was, he realized, a form of investment. She visited the terrace each evening, not in ceremony, not in court dress. In the simpler draped garments he'd first seen her wear in the inner sanctum, her filament hair loose and responsive, her luminescence shifting through its full range as she spoke. She sat across from him with her long legs extended toward the warmth of the setting sun, and they talked, really talked, the way people do when they've run out of reasons to perform. She told him things about the loneliness of a crown that everyone respects and no one questions, about the 12-year war her mother had ended at the cost of half the northern territories, and how Seraphil had grown up understanding that leadership meant perpetual sacrifice, but had not been prepared for the specific, quiet sacrifice of never being known, about the 4 counselors who feared her and the 3 who underestimated her, and how none of that overlap with anyone who simply saw her. He told her things too, about Dana, the marriage that had been good and then suddenly wasn't, the way 2 people can drift so gradually that you only recognize the distance when one of you stops reaching, about the reason he'd volunteered for this mission when most of his colleagues had declined. Not ambition exactly, but a hunger for something that mattered, something whose stakes were large enough to require all of him. "You came here to be necessary," Seraphil said one evening. The orange sun was low, painting her cobalt skin in shades of rose and copper. Her filament hair moved slowly in the sea breeze. "I came here to help," he said. "Those are not the same thing." She watched him. "But in your case, they may both be true simultaneously, which is rarer than you know." On the 4th evening she reached across the space between them and placed her long, warm fingers against his wrist. Not the Veishal, nothing ritualized, simply contact. Simple, chosen, human in its instinct if not its execution. Ethan turned his hand over slowly. She didn't move away. "The council is pressuring me to formalize your role," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Elder Veth wants a ceremony, a public declaration. He believes if it is ritualized, it can be controlled." Her copper eyes moved to his. "What they do not understand is that the Veishal cannot be made into performance retroactively. It either was genuine or it was not, and it—" She paused, and her luminescence deepened to the amber he'd come to understand meant something she wasn't accustomed to saying. "It was." "I know," he said. Her fingers remained on his wrist. His hand remained open beneath hers. "This will become complicated," she said. "You understand that. An Earth ambassador bound by Vorin right. My council's suspicion. Your government's hesitation. Those who will say it was calculated, on your part, or mine, or both. Let them say it." She looked at him with something that was learning to be surprised. "You are not afraid of the complexity. I told you. I'm very afraid. I'm just better at managing it than I look." The deep resonance came from her chest again, the laugh she was still learning to own. They stayed on the terrace until the second moon rose and the bioluminescent tide began to come in, turning the ocean below them into fire. Her hand remained warm against his wrist. His thumb moved once slowly across her knuckles, a small thing, a human thing, a gesture without a name in either language. Her filament hair drifted upward, just slightly. Earth's committee sent their response that night, a cautious, conditional, bureaucratically hedged approval of his extended posting with 17 attached stipulations. Seraphiel read the document over his shoulder. 17 conditions, she said flatly. That's actually fewer than I expected. She made a sound of Vorin disdain that needed no translation. He laughed, genuinely unguardedly, and her luminescence flared warm and sudden in response, like a reflex she hadn't caught in time. They looked at each other in the aftermath of it, in the space where pretense runs out. Stay, she said. Not the formal offer of a queen, just the word plainly, from someone who meant it. Outside, the twin moons hung above Ethon 7 full and close, and the tide came in glowing, and somewhere deep beneath the palace, in records older than most Earth civilizations, a name was being inscribed beside a queen's, the first in 300 years, in the language of covenant and chosen trust. Ethan Voss had come to an alien world to represent humanity. He had ended up representing something older than diplomacy, the particular and irreducible power of a single genuine gesture between two people learning to see each other clearly. And whatever came next, the politics, the pressure, the history being written around them, it had started simply with his hands and her exhaustion and a moment when neither of them performed. Some things begin that way. The most important things usually do. And